You're terrified of boredom. The moment you feel it coming, you reach for your phone, scroll social media, start a video, check messages, anything to avoid that uncomfortable feeling of having nothing to do, nothing to consume, nothing to distract you from yourself. Carl Jung would say that terror is destroying your psyche, and your constant escape from boredom is preventing the most important psychological work you'll ever do. Jung discovered that boredom isn't your enemy. It's the doorway to your unconscious. It's the psychological state where your deeper self can finally speak because your ego has stopped drowning it out with stimulation. Every time you escape boredom, you're running from the very thing that could transform you. I'm about to explain why Jung believed boredom is essential for psychological development, what happens in your psyche when you're bored, and why the most important insights of your life are waiting in the space you keep filling with distraction. If you can't tolerate being bored, Jung would say, you can't access your depths. And without your depths, you'll never become who you actually are. Here's what Jung understood that modern society has forgotten. Boredom is not empty time to be filled. It's sacred psychological space where transformation happens. But we've built an entire civilization designed to eliminate boredom, and in doing so, we've eliminated the conditions necessary for consciousness to develop. Think about your day. How many seconds pass between waking and checking your phone? How long can you sit without reaching for stimulation? How often do you allow yourself to be genuinely, completely, uncomfortably bored? For most people, the answer is never. We've engineered boredom out of existence. But Jung discovered that the unconscious requires boredom to communicate with consciousness. When your mind is constantly occupied with external stimulation, your unconscious can't get through. It's trying to send messages, images, insights, directions, but you're too busy consuming content to receive them. Boredom is the psychological equivalent of silence. And just as you can't hear someone speaking if you're in a noisy room, you can't hear your unconscious if your mind is constantly occupied with external input. The stimulation isn't just distracting you from boredom, it's preventing psychological development. Jung spent deliberate time in boredom. He would sit by the lake at Boredom doing nothing, not meditating, not contemplating, just being bored. And in that boredom, his unconscious would begin to speak. Images would arise. Insights would emerge. The psyche would start doing its transformative work. But it could only happen in the space created by boredom. If you can't be bored, Jung would say, you're preventing your unconscious from doing the work it needs to do. And that work is how you become whole. So, what exactly is happening in your psyche during boredom that makes it so essential? Jung's first insight reveals the mechanism. Boredom isn't dead time. It's the only time your unconscious has access to your conscious awareness. When you're constantly stimulated, your conscious mind is fully occupied processing external input. Your unconscious can't get a word in, but when you're bored, your conscious mind quiets. And in that quiet, the unconscious rises. Here's how this works. Your unconscious is always producing material, dreams, images, intuitions, symbols. But during your waking hours, this material is usually drowned out by conscious activity and external stimulation. It's like trying to see stars during the day. They're always there, but the sun makes them invisible. Boredom is psychological nightfall. When you stop consuming external stimulation, when you allow yourself to just sit with nothing to do, your conscious mind dims like the setting sun. And suddenly, the stars, the unconscious material, become visible. Thoughts you've been avoiding surface. Feelings you've been suppressing emerge. Insights about your life begin to crystallize. But most people panic the moment boredom begins. They feel the unconscious starting to rise and immediately reach for their phone. They'd rather scroll through strangers' lives than sit with what's emerging from their own depths. They mistake the discomfort of unconscious material surfacing for the problem of boredom itself. Jung noticed this pattern constantly. People would come to analysis complaining of feeling stuck, lost, or unclear about their direction. He'd ask about their relationship with boredom. Invariably, they couldn't tolerate it. Every free moment was filled with activity, entertainment, or distraction. Their unconscious had been trying to give them the guidance they needed, but they'd never created the space for it to speak. One of the most powerful practices Jung used was what he called active imagination, deliberately entering a state of boredom and allowing whatever arose to arise. Not forcing it, not directing it, just creating space and waiting. In that bored waiting, the unconscious would begin presenting images, feelings, and insights that couldn't emerge during conscious activity. This is why creative breakthroughs happen in the shower, on walks, or while staring at walls. These are rare moments of boredom in modern life. Your unconscious finally has a chance to deliver the insights it's been holding. But imagine if instead of these accidental moments of boredom, you deliberately created space for your unconscious to speak. That's what Jung did. That's what transformed him. But here's what makes this challenging. What emerges during boredom isn't always pleasant. Sometimes it's anxiety about your life choices. Sometimes it's grief you've been avoiding. Sometimes it's the awareness that you're living falsely and need to change everything. Your unconscious isn't a self-help coach, it's truth teller, and sometimes the truth is uncomfortable. This discomfort is precisely why people are so terrified of boredom. Not because boredom itself is painful, but because what emerges during boredom might be painful. So they fill every moment with stimulation, never realizing that the discomfort they're avoiding is exactly what needs to be felt, processed, and integrated for them to grow. Which brings us to an even deeper problem with constant stimulation. Beyond just blocking your unconscious from speaking, Jung discovered that constant stimulation actively prevents you from becoming who you actually are. His second insight reveals why. Individuation, becoming your authentic self, requires extended periods of unstimulated reflection. And constant stimulation doesn't just prevent boredom, it prevents you from discovering your true nature. Here's what happens psychologically when you're always stimulated. Your identity becomes constructed from external input rather than internal development. You absorb others' opinions, adopt cultural values unconsciously, and build a persona based on what you consume. You think you're forming yourself, but you're actually being formed by whatever content you're consuming. Individuation requires the opposite process. You need to withdraw from external input, sit with yourself unstimulated, and allow your authentic nature to emerge from within. But that emergence only happens in the absence of external stimulation. In the boredom, you keep escaping. Think about how identity forms when you're constantly consuming content. You watch videos about who you should be, scroll through images of lives you should want, absorb ideas about what success means. Your psyche is being programmed by external sources. You're not discovering yourself. You're downloading a self from the collective. But when you're bored, something different happens. Without external input to distract you, you start noticing what actually interests you versus what you've been told should interest you. You feel what you actually want versus what you've been conditioned to want. You hear your authentic voice versus the internalized voices of others. Jung emphasized that individuation isn't about becoming something. It's about discovering what you already are beneath all the external conditioning. but you can't discover what's beneath if you never stop adding layers on top. Boredom is when you stop adding layers, and in that stopping, what's beneath can finally be felt. This is why people who are constantly stimulated often feel like they don't know themselves. They don't. They've never created the space necessary for self-knowledge to develop. They know what they consume, what they've been told, what they perform, but they don't know their actual nature because they've never been bored enough to meet it. Jung would spend weeks at Boredom with minimal external input. No radio, no newspapers, no social obligations. Just him, the lake, and vast stretches of unstimulated time. In that space, his authentic self would emerge clearly. He'd know what he actually thought versus what he'd absorbed from others. He'd feel what he genuinely wanted versus what he'd been conditioned to pursue. But here's the challenge. When you first stop stimulating yourself, what emerges isn't immediately your authentic self. First, you experience withdrawal, anxiety, restlessness, compulsive urges to check your phone. This is your addiction to stimulation showing itself. Most people experience this discomfort and conclude boredom is terrible and go back to constant stimulation. But Jung would say, push through that withdrawal, stay bored despite the discomfort. After the withdrawal symptoms pass, after the anxiety settles, something deeper emerges. That's when you start meeting yourself. That's when individuation becomes possible. But you have to tolerate the uncomfortable transition period where your psyche is adjusting to operating without constant external input. Modern life has made this nearly impossible. Every moment of potential boredom has been filled with design stimulation. Waiting rooms have TVS, elevators have screens. Even walking down the street, people are plugged into podcasts. We've eliminated the very conditions that Jung said were essential for psychological development. And there's another layer to this that's even more revealing about why we avoid boredom so desperately. Here's where Jung's insight gets uncomfortable. The intensity of your need to escape boredom reveals the intensity of what you're unconsciously avoiding. The more desperately you flee boredom, the more important the material your unconscious is trying to show you. The psychological mechanism works like this. Your unconscious knows what needs to be addressed. Unprocessed grief, avoided decisions, denied truths, suppressed desires. When you're constantly stimulated, it can't show you these things. But when boredom begins, when stimulation stops, this material starts rising toward consciousness. And your ego, sensing uncomfortable material approaching, creates an urgent need for distraction. That desperate reach for your phone isn't random. It's your ego protecting you from what your unconscious is about to reveal. The problem is, what you're avoiding is usually exactly what you need to face to grow. So, your protection mechanism is actually a growth prevention mechanism. Pay attention to when the urge to escape boredom is strongest. What were you thinking about right before you reach for distraction? What feeling was starting to surface? What question was beginning to form? That's what your unconscious was trying to bring to your attention. And that's what your ego interrupted by seeking stimulation. Jung noticed this pattern in his patients. Those who most compulsively avoided boredom were usually avoiding the most important psychological work. The executive who couldn't sit still for 5 minutes was avoiding awareness that his success meant nothing to him. The mother who filled every moment with activity was avoiding grief about her unlived life. The student who constantly consumed content was avoiding the question of what he actually wanted. The avoidance isn't conscious. No one thinks, I'm going to distract myself to avoid uncomfortable truths. It's automatic. Discomfort begins, hand reaches for phone, Distraction provides relief, but that relief comes at the cost of never addressing what caused the discomfort. The pattern repeats indefinitely, and the unconscious material never gets processed. This is why Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Your avoidance of boredom isn't keeping you safe from discomfort. It's keeping you unconscious of the patterns running your life. What you won't face in boredom, you'll act out unconsciously in your choices, relationships, and suffering. But here's what's liberating. Once you understand that your urge to escape boredom is actually your psyche, trying to protect you from important material, you can override it. When you feel the desperate need for stimulation, you can recognize it as a signal that something important is trying to emerge. Instead of reaching for your phone, you can stay with the boredom and let the material surface. This requires tremendous courage. You're essentially choosing to feel what you've been unconsciously avoiding, possibly for years. The grief surfaces, the anxiety emerges. The truth you've been denying becomes undeniable. It's uncomfortable. But Jung would say, that discomfort is the price of consciousness, and consciousness is the only path to wholeness. Now, you might think this all sounds very therapeutic, but impractical. What does any of this have to do with actually accomplishing things in life? Jung's next insight shows that boredom isn't just psychologically necessary, it's practically essential for everything meaningful you want to create. If you're recognizing this, that you can't tolerate boredom, that you compulsively escape it, that you fill every moment with stimulation, Jung would say you're preventing your unconscious from doing its transformative work. Every escape from boredom is an escape from yourself. Before we explore how boredom creates breakthrough and why it's essential for consciousness, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Let's continue, because these next insights reveal why your greatest creative breakthroughs require boredom, and how boredom is actually initiating you into deeper consciousness. So, if boredom allows your unconscious to speak, prevents false identity formation, and reveals what you're avoiding, what does this mean for actually creating something meaningful? Jung's fourth insight answers this. The creative process doesn't happen during stimulation. It happens during the unstimulated gaps. Every major insight, every creative breakthrough, every moment of genius emerges from boredom, not from consuming more content or seeking more stimulation. Here's how creativity actually works psychologically. Your unconscious is constantly processing, combining, and synthesizing material beneath your conscious awareness. It's making connections you can't consciously make, seeing patterns you can't consciously see, generating solutions to problems you can't consciously solve. But this processing happens in the background, not in the foreground of your awareness. When you're constantly stimulated, your conscious mind is so occupied that the unconscious can't deliver its results. It's completed the creative work, but it can't get your attention to present what it's discovered. Boredom is when the delivery happens. In that understimulated space, your unconscious can finally present the insight it's been working on. This is why solutions to problems suddenly appear while you're in the shower, or walking, or doing nothing. Your unconscious finished solving the problem hours or days ago. But this is the first moment your conscious mind was quiet enough to receive the solution. The insight didn't happen in the shower. It emerged in the shower because that was your first moment of boredom. Jung did his most important creative work in periods of extended boredom. His concept of archetypes, synchronicity, the collective unconscious, these didn't come from reading more, thinking more, or working harder. They emerged during long stretches at Bohlingen, where he did nothing but allow his unconscious to present what it had been processing. The boredom wasn't wasted time. It was productive space where creativity happened. But modern culture has inverted this completely. We believe creativity comes from consuming more content, more inspiration, more input. So, people trying to be creative consume constantly, filling their minds with others' ideas, never creating the space for their own ideas to emerge. They're so busy inputting that they never allow output. This is why so many people feel blocked creatively. They're not blocked, they're overstimulated. Their unconscious has plenty of creative material ready to emerge, but they've never created the conditions for emergence. They need less input, not more. They need boredom, not inspiration. Jung's advice for creative breakthrough was counterintuitive. Stop trying to be creative. Stop consuming creative content. Stop seeking inspiration. Instead, sit in deliberate boredom and wait. Let your mind wander. Let yourself be unstimulated. Trust that your unconscious is working even when you're not consciously producing. And eventually, in that bored waiting, the breakthrough will emerge. This requires patience that most people don't have anymore. We expect immediate results, but psychological and creative processes don't work on demand. Your unconscious isn't a vending machine where you input effort and get output. It works in its own time, at its own pace. Your job is to create the conditions, the boredom, where it can deliver when it's ready. The most important thing you'll create probably won't come from trying to create it. It'll come from being bored enough that your unconscious can finally show you what it's been working on while you weren't paying attention. But Jung understood that boredom offers something even more profound than creative insight. It's actually transforming your consciousness itself in ways that determine who you can become. This brings us to Jung's deepest insight about boredom, one that reveals why it's not just useful, but actually initiatory. The ability to tolerate deep boredom is the mark of psychological maturity. And learning to stay bored is how you develop the consciousness necessary for individuation. Here's what Jung understood. Consciousness develops in stages, and each stage requires greater capacity to tolerate psychological discomfort. Children can't tolerate boredom at all. They need constant stimulation. Adolescents can tolerate brief periods but need regular external engagement. Adults who've never developed beyond collective consciousness still require near constant stimulation. But individuated people can sit in deep boredom for extended periods without distress. This isn't about discipline or willpower. It's about what Jung called psychological carrying capacity, how much internal tension and discomfort your psyche can hold without collapsing into compulsive action. The more developed your consciousness, the more boredom you can tolerate. And conversely, learning to tolerate boredom develops your consciousness. Boredom is uncomfortable because it creates a vacuum that your psyche naturally wants to fill. When you sit unstimulated, you feel that vacuum acutely. Your mind races, your body gets restless, anxiety rises. Most people immediately fill that vacuum with stimulation, which relieves the discomfort but prevents any development. But Jung discovered, if you can sit in that vacuum without filling it, something transformative happens. Your psyche begins organizing itself differently. It starts generating from within rather than absorbing from without. You develop what Jung called the relationship with the self, the ability to be psychologically complete without external input. This is why extended boredom feels like initiation. You're learning to exist in psychological space that most people can't tolerate. You're developing internal resources that others never access because they never stop stimulating themselves long enough to discover those resources exist. You're essentially training your psyche to operate at a higher level of consciousness. Jung would prescribe boredom to patients the way others might prescribe medication. He'd tell them, spend 3 hours this weekend doing absolutely nothing. No reading, no music, no productive activity. Just sit and be bored. Many would return saying it was the most difficult thing they'd done. But those who could do it reported profound shifts, sudden clarity about their lives, emotional releases they'd been blocking, creative insights they'd been seeking. The practice wasn't about the boredom itself. It was about developing the consciousness necessary to individuate. If you can't tolerate being alone with yourself, unstimulated, you can't access your depths. And without access to your depths, you remain at surface consciousness, which is where most people live their entire lives. This is the ultimate reason why boredom matters. It's not just where insights emerge or creativity happens. It's where consciousness itself develops. Every moment you stay bored when your impulse is to seek stimulation, you're strengthening your psychological capacity. You're training yourself to exist at a level of consciousness most people never reach. Let me bring this together. Boredom is when the unconscious can finally speak because your conscious mind stops drowning it out with stimulation. Constant stimulation prevents individuation by keeping you oriented toward external input rather than internal development. Boredom reveals what you're avoiding. The stronger your need to escape it, the more important what you're fleeing. Creative breakthrough requires boredom because that's when your unconscious can deliver the insights it's been processing. And boredom is initiatory. Learning to tolerate it develops the consciousness necessary for individuation. Jung would say, if you can't be bored, you can't become whole. Every escape from boredom is an escape from the psychological work your unconscious is trying to do. Every moment filled with stimulation is a moment your depths can't access your awareness. Every compulsive reach for distraction is a denial of what needs to emerge. Modern society has taught you that boredom is the enemy, something to be eliminated, avoided, filled immediately. But Jung understood. Boredom is sacred space. It's where transformation happens. It's where your unconscious speaks. It's where your authentic self emerges. It's where creativity births. It's where consciousness develops. The practice isn't complicated. Stop filling every moment. Allow yourself to be genuinely, deeply, uncomfortably bored. Sit with it. Feel it. Don't escape it. And trust that in that bored space, your psyche is doing work that can only happen when you stop preventing it with constant stimulation. If you can't tolerate being bored, Jung would tell you, you're preventing the most important work your psyche needs to do. You're blocking your unconscious from speaking, avoiding what needs to be faced, preventing creative emergence, and stopping your consciousness from developing beyond surface level. Start small. 5 minutes of deliberate boredom. No phone, no book, no music, no productive activity. Just sitting. Being bored, feeling the discomfort, noticing the urge to escape, and staying anyway. What will you discover in that boredom? Maybe nothing at first, maybe just restlessness and anxiety. But if you keep practicing, if you keep creating space, your unconscious will eventually use that space. Insights will emerge, truths will surface, creativity will flow, and your consciousness will begin developing in ways that are impossible when you're constantly stimulated. Boredom isn't empty time to be filled. It's full time to be honored. It's your unconscious waiting to speak. It's your authentic self trying to emerge. It's your creative depths ready to deliver. It's your consciousness preparing to develop. Stop running from it. Start using it. The boredom you're avoiding is the doorway to everything you're seeking. If you're ready to reclaim boredom as a tool for transformation instead of something to escape, subscribe to the channel. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.